Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Marco Mai, and today's topic is one that I'm sure many of us have heard about or think about a lot. It's about going to be money and happiness. Money is a really core facet of modern society. And quite frankly, there's nothing that's going to get you past that. It's not to put anyone into existential dread, but obviously, a lot of us have to care about our financial situation and our money and how we spend it, and also the mindset that we have behind it. For us now, money just dictates how we live, it dictates where we live, what we can buy, and often reaches really deep into things that we don't consider as well. Things like how our financial situation plays into our hobbies, how we can do things like travel, and how it even influences the kind of people that we meet and how we can form relationships. Money is actually a pretty touchy topic for me because I personally grew up in a not super financially healthy household, and that resulted in me developing some financial issues from it. It's a bit too personal to share here, but just know that money has been a big part of my life. And I also imagine it's been a really big part of your life too. Really, it doesn't really matter how rich you are or how poor you are. You could have been someone who's really mindful about their spending, someone who hoards a lot of money, someone who's buying the next thing, or someone who shows their wealth off. The bottom line is that money is really important and social class plays a role in your character. And I even go as far to say is that it plays a role in forming your personality. So this brings us to today's topic of money and happiness. Because if you've been around the block of psychology and economics, there's this really highly debated topic, and it's about how does money make you happy? Because originally, in many books, articles, research papers, we used to believe that typically money plateaued in how much it would actually generate happiness for us. But in more recent years, as we continue to replicate and test the validity of past studies, this topic has come up again. We know now that there's a lot more depth to money and how it actually plays a role in our happiness. Studies have potentially shown that happiness does follow money all the way to the top, and that having more money does equal more happiness. So now that we're here and we're kind of in this interesting position, there's some discrepancies. And hopefully, as you're a semi expert in research, I've been the one who's been able to take the deep dive into all of these papers so that I can give you a broader perspective on money and happiness. So, with today, we're going to be talking all about the major studies around money, how it affects happiness, Gen Z specific fixation on wealth, answering the question around money and happiness, and finally, what can we do as individuals to be just a little bit more happy, factoring wealth into the equation. So, if any or all of that excites you, please stay tuned as we're just about to jump into the mind of Gen Z. So, let's kick off immediately with the study. So, the original study in 2010 was made by the Economic Nobel Prize winning Kahneman and Deaton. And what they found is that happiness only increased up to an income of around $75,000 or about $110,000 in today's world after inflation. They claimed that after this point, more income didn't actually impact overall happiness that much. And this came from survey data of over 450,000 Americans, so they thought that it was a very good sample. They effectively came up with a theory that lack of money was associated with less leisure time, poor health, and general emotional pain. You had lacked the security and you were under stress more often, resulting you in being unhappy because you need that money to pay for your house, your rent, your food, your dependents, and God knows if you'll ever be able to take a break if you can't meet your basic needs. Their theory continued. And so that went that once you got past meeting those general basic needs, once you actually have a car and a house and are able to afford your life, more money doesn't drive more happiness. Money has served its purpose in your life by now reducing the stress that you generally experience, and more money in buying you things doesn't actually contribute strongly to your happiness. They said that health, relationships, and leisure time contributed much more to strongly benefiting your emotional well being and therefore your perceived happiness of your situation. However, That isn't to say that more money isn't good. They did also note that greater income had no plateau with life satisfaction. The more money that you made, the more satisfied that you are with your life. So, this meant that even if you made more money, you might not be more happy, but you'd be more satisfied. And they said this because they believed that it's less about the money and more about the actual internal achievement. That whatever it is that you've done, whether it was a career success, maybe if you got lucky, even that you feel that you've done something where you are better than you were in the past and that you've accomplished something in your life. And this paper by Kahneman was basically treated as truth for a very long time. Money, basically up until a point, didn't buy you any more safety and security, and therefore no longer increased happiness by very large amounts. In fact, this study was even backed up by the Harvard study on happiness, which is the longest study on happiness that we know and is really seen as the pinnacle of happiness studies. What they observed in the Harvard study was also pretty similar, that extra material wealth didn't actually mean a much larger increase in happiness. And it was a lot more about relationships for your life satisfaction as opposed to material goods. Obviously, there are some other findings, and although there are also some skeptics about the sample for the Harvard study, it's worth noting that they also did bring on families across Boston, including disadvantaged families, so the sample is actually pretty well rounded. However, these studies on happiness ended up getting challenged in 2021 by Killingsworth. Here, Killingsworth asked 34,000 volunteers about their emotions and their income. And in this study, he found that a large income was robustly associated with happiness and life satisfaction. There is virtually no plateau at any point of income to happiness ratio. More was more, and that was that, even though it wasn't technically perfect 1 to 1. But this is where the beauty of research came in. Up until this point, Kahneman and Killingsworth were really questioning what happened because they both did a similar study and all the researchers knew that something was weird. How could the results be so different even if they were a decade apart? As researchers, though, they knew that they had to find an actual answer. And so they set aside their pride, they set aside their differences, and they came together to make a collaborative paper in 2023. In this paper, they took a look at their old datasets and methods and found out what the issues were. In the original 2010 paper, Kahneman realized that the way they measured happiness was just way too simple. People didn't report on a graded scale of 1 to 10, for example. They were simply measured on if they were happy or not. But of course, if you're happy, there's no difference in happiness between those who are incredibly rich and happy and those who are poor and happy, even though they might be happy and rate it differently on the scale. So this is a very clear issue, and that helped explain the original paper's findings. Now, on the other hand, Killingsworth paper had one issue, even though it was definitely slightly smaller, and that is there is a small subsection of the population who didn't find happiness improvement once they hit around that 110,000 mark of income. So again, inflation adjusted. Who was this subsection? Well, it's the subsection that was already generally not that fulfilled with their life. In this case and in this sample, they only found it in about 20% of the sample, but it was also really worth noting still. That meant that 1 in 5 people won't actually see their lives improve as they gain more income. And they say that this is because that if they're not already living a life that they actually like, having more money doesn't help. There's an internal issue with who they are and why they're unhappy that really has nothing to do with what money can and cannot solve. Instead, that person has to do internal work and then they can resolve those issues before they really reap those benefits from having increased income. This is where we get into juicy parts of the research, though. More money seems to create more happiness, but we also want to understand why. If we make above $110,000 and we continue to make more and more, does it really help my happiness a lot just because I can buy more things? Well, in some ways, yes, but there are, I think, much sweeter reasons for this. Firstly, money does ultimately reduce the kinds of challenges and difficulties you might face in life. Having financial security can help protect you from the stress of life negative events. So think about the times where maybe after a breakup you wanted to go traveling or you went to a concert. If you went through a health crisis, then having some extra money helped act as a cushion and make sure that you felt safe, even though you might be taking a step away from work. Regardless of what it is, having more money helps you feel less defeated against the negative events that might come your way throughout life. Secondly, money simply gives us more choice, freedom, and control about our lives. We have more availability to choose where we want to live, to buy things we want, but also beyond all of that is specifically that more money makes us feel less limited. By having money, we develop a sense of autonomy over our lives, and that contributes to a holistic sense of well being. It's a sense that we don't feel like our lives are just passing by us and that we have to do things to live and to work. We can actually enjoy our lives and we have a choice to be happy and a choice to live more fulfilling lives for ourselves. Thirdly, and I think this is a really important one, is that money actually enhances our happiness past what it normally is. And I think this is the key part of the original study that was missed. While at some point you become happy because your woes and your issues and your worries are no longer a major concern, you can still increase your happiness past that baseline. And the main way to do this is one of two things. One, it's by buying experiences, by traveling, by going on trips, by doing unique activities that you'll remember for a lifetime. Those are really meaningful things that create long lasting memories, and that in general increases your happiness. The second one is by developing or deepening relationships. This one is a really big one because the research behind it is really interesting, actually. For example, I probably don't need to tell you that buying something or things for yourself is actually going to make you pretty happy, but typically it's not going to give you long term happiness. If you're constantly out there looking to buy the hottest new collectible, the best new shoes, another cute dress, sure, it's going to make you happy for a little bit, but it's not going to provide you with joy over just a couple of weeks or even a couple of days. But actually, what might make you happier in the long term is buying things for the people in your life, your friends, your family, and your partner. Research shows that buying things for your relationships is one of the best ways to make yourself happier in the long term. And I think it actually matches with some of my experiences too. I remember that one of my favorite gifts I ever gave to someone, they were really excited to have. And they literally spent like the entire day showing it off to their family. And I could feel the joy that they had. And that made me really happy. They don't actually use my gift at all anymore. But for the time or for the times that they're using it, it was a really sweet feeling that we both shared. And it further strengthened our relationship. Another thing that money helps you with is it makes you deal with your relationships better. Therapy, counseling, activities, or having the money to go out and hang with your friends all contribute to enhancing your relationships or making new ones. And these are what's really integral to happiness as we know it. Again, the Harvard study on happiness, and really most happiness studies in general, really try to make it firm that the most important relationships in your life, like your friendships, your family, your partner, those are the things that are going to make the longest and strongest impact on your happiness. However, we also have to be careful with how we treat money and happiness. Hearing about all of this research hopefully hasn't made you think to yourself that you need to get on the money grind. And here are four reasons why. So, one, research by PNAS Nexus found that those with incredibly high wealth tend to only be slightly happier than those in the middle class. Sure, they do tend to be happier, but they note that there's an overlap between the two financial classes despite being so far apart, because the way that money affects your happiness is very personal. So, for instance, those who are ultra wealthy but struggle to use that wealth to do things like enhance their relationships, if they don't donate to charities, if they don't feel good about their wealth, if they're not actually contributing to their relationships or finding purpose in their life, then they are not going to feel very differently to the middle class who struggle the same. In contrast, those who are in the middle class and those people who feel like they've hit most of their stresses and they can tuck them away, but they're still able to also use their wealth to gain things that they want, to go on trips and whatnot. If they accept their situation and they feel good about it, then they're actually going to feel better than a couple of people who are in the ultra wealthy. So you can see that the way individuals treat their money is a bit more indicative of their happiness rather than money itself. Secondly, and following on the last point, once you get past financial security, money has a much more diminishing influence on your happiness. So Killingsworth notes in his 2021 paper that an increase from 20,000 to 60,000 income would dramatically increase your happiness. But to see that same level of happiness increase from 60,000, you have to go all the way up to 180,000. So we can see that there's an exponential increase in income that relates to happiness. Originally, getting an extra $10,000, $20,000, it can be a really big life change for you. But once you get a point of financial security, especially, there needs an exponential increase in income for you to feel more happy that comes with that money. And so, again, we kind of see that gaining more money, sure, it might make you more happy, but it's a lot more convoluted than that. Thirdly, as I said before, there is a small subsection of the world, about 20%, who would not see major increases of happiness with an increased income. This is because, again, factors like your health, your relationships, the amount of leisure time you have, your purpose and meaning, your satisfaction with your job, unresolved traumas, all of these play major roles in your happiness. And this is majorly why we get a lot of unhappy rich millionaires and billionaires. Yes, it is certainly a minority of them, but it doesn't change the fact that regardless of your riches, you might still be unhappy because of your internal state of happiness. Arguably, I would even say that once you achieve a greater sense of happiness internally, that's when the effects of gaining more financial wealth become even greater. Lastly, and this might be the one that's going to set you off, is that there is a distinction between seeking money and having money. So, the simple act of seeking money and pursuing it as a goal is actually a lot less satisfying than actually having money and being content with the amount that you have. For example, if you have two people that both have $100,000, but one of them is still stressed and they're seeking out more ways to use that money, if they're thinking that 100,000 isn't enough, I need 200,000, I need 500,000, compared to the person who is really grateful for that 100,000, they are going to be a lot more stressed and they're going to be a lot more unhappy. It's not to say that seeking more money is inherently unhealthy, but the point is that if you ride on the hedonistic treadmill that you constantly need more, you're never going to take the time to appreciate what it is that you already have. And as a result, you're actually going to find that money is going to stress you out a lot more because you're constantly seeking it rather than enjoying it. In general, the way that money factors and attributes to our happiness is really unique, and it's also not linear. I also think that it's really sweet that in the research, despite having such different findings, people are really able to reconcile their differences to seek out the truth. It's a really human narrative on how we actually should approach the human psyche and, in general, what the pursuit of knowledge is really about. It honestly kind of reminds me because I had this roommate who would always talk about this, but it was really this like rivals to lovers theme. And I just thought it was really cute, which is why I wanted to mention it. Now, if you've listened to any of my other episodes, you would know that there are also a couple of major recurring themes that surround this generation and the issues that we uniquely deal with. One of these, of course, is our financial situation and how we as a generation deal with our money. Gen Z in particular seems to be really strongly thinking about money and our future and our purpose and our careers because, frankly, for us, it's really important. In just a decade, if you look at the inflation numbers, it went from 75,000 to 110,000 in just over 10 years for the quote unquote point of financial security. Not to mention that that's making $110,000 in USD. And that puts you in the 80% of earners in the US, which means that 80% of people are below you in terms of that threshold of financial security. And again, it's USD. They're one of the biggest financial players in the world and one of the strongest incomes in the world. To put that into perspective, as a Canadian, I would need, or my household would need, if you're doing a dual income, about a net income of about $150,000 to reap those same benefits. And so for us, that means I would need to be around a top 10% earner. And again, Canada is another first world country. So you can imagine how people feel about their financial worries when they're in other countries that are less fortunate. And that's why our generation is so focused on our financial worries, so focused on our careers, and so focused on generating wealth. This isn't a career podcast, or at the very least, this isn't a career episode. So I won't be trying to sell you or tell you about like a get rich quick scheme or anything like that. But instead, I'm just here to reinforce the notion that if you feel like money is really important to you, your happiness and your well being, that is completely normal. Frankly, the research supports the entire thing about Gen Z's focus on money. Not only do we instinctively probably know that it will make us happy, as we've seen in the research, but we also live in a world where financial well being and health is harder to achieve than ever. Particularly over the past 2 years, many countries, including the UK, Canada, and the US, have found that wages are not keeping up with inflation anymore, seen in research by Statista, the Royal Bank of Canada, and the Economic Policy Institute. Again, these are first world countries, and so if one of them has economic issues, it also affects the whole world. And of course, that means it affects us as individuals. In some ways, it is kind of sad because many people probably also live in a world or live around people who tell them that money isn't super important. And I'm willing to admit it. I was one of those people. I would tell that to a lot of my friends that they needed to focus a little bit less on their money. But the research shows and proves itself that today money is harder to get than before, plays a massive role in our happiness, and quite frankly, needs to be a primary focus in our day to day lives. We can, though, focus and shift our attention now to our demographic. So, what Gen Z feels and expects with money. And I think this is where things get a little bit brighter, even though there's a lot of doom and gloom around it, but we'll get into that. So, firstly, there's a pretty hefty amount of research that shows that one of the biggest financial woes of Gen Z is the housing crisis. For most of us, we have to pay an absurd price to live somewhere. Housing prices have gone up several times over the past years, so even if wages were keeping up with inflation, the cost of housing has gone up dramatically and it's not easy to get housing anymore. Obviously, I can't just do the research on every single place in the world, and every single place is just a little bit different. For example, Austin, Texas, they've actually dealt with increased needs for housing, and they've actually been able to deal with it quite well, and they have cooling housing prices because of good government practices. However, some places, especially in Canada or in more dense locations of the world, the story is the complete opposite. For example, average rent prices in San Francisco have doubled in just 2 decades. And mind you, while this area does command higher wages thanks to things like its booming tech sector, that doesn't necessarily mean that the wages are continuing to go up and the wages have responded kindly to both increasing housing and inflation costs. I think San Francisco also brings attention another issue for Gen Z specifically, and that is career development. Again, Gen Z is really focused on career development, on finding purpose, on doing more. Statistically, we are the current generation which rates the highest for a desire to develop more skills, take on more responsibilities, and find work that better aligns with our values. This often means that to find these things, our generation wants to be in larger cities where we can do more development, more personal development, and have more career development. It's more robust and it's typically faster paced. As someone who personally moved from a small city to the biggest city in Canada, I could tell that it did fit me and my personal goals a little bit more. Since we see that on average, our generation wants to be developing and they want to be growing, and especially I think there's kind of a rush for some of us. Some of us feel like that when we're in our 20s or when we're graduating or whenever we're doing school, we want to make the right choices because we want to get to where we want to be faster and spend more time doing things that we actually want to do. And sometimes that just means that we want to be in larger cities where development is faster. But there's a balance because if we want to live in those denser cities, that means that we also have to deal with those cost of living hardships and those increasing housing prices. This entire topic can get really muddy, and unless you guys want me to do one in the future, I'm not really here to talk about the housing market and the issues surrounding it. Rather, my point is to show that our generation may be struggling financially because of reasons like this. While there are still many people who are doing well in our generation, I want to also point out that this is more so because of the wealth gap. And so that we see in research, especially in Canada, that about 68% of the wealth in Canada is held by the top 20% of people. And it's only gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. There's such a dramatic difference between families who are able to get by and families who aren't. And this can get further perpetuated because of social media and how easy it is to purchase things online. So, research shows that Gen Z is the generation who's most likely to impulse purchase at 41% of our generation. And if you really think about that, that again is two in five of your friends that are really into impulse purchases. And I'm sure that not everyone that you know and all of your friends have the ability to do that. However, it's so easy for us to do it because now when you order something, it can get to your door immediately. You can order food, you can get something in a game, you can do collectibles. There's so many things that we want to purchase that in general, a lot of us are likely to do impulse purchasing. However, I think that this article from Mark Beal puts the perspective of money in Gen Z's hands really well. Even though I just said all of those things, it's not necessarily that our generation is less financially responsible than other generations. Rather, the set goals for our generation, especially in regards to wealth and the accumulation of wealth, is a lot less prominent and a lot more diverse. Things like homeownership or maximizing our retirement savings isn't as much on our mind as it is to simply enjoy and experience the world. And again, there's a balance with everything, but in general, this can be a good thing. I think we often hear about how people say, I wish I started investing earlier. And I'm sure that's true. And I'm sure that if you're the kind of person who wants to do that, like myself, that you do want to invest. But also, we know that it is when money is used for others, when money is used for experiences, when money is used for actual enjoyment of the world, that you get to reap some of the benefits of having wealth. The mindset shift is that we work to live rather than we live to work. And even though I'm sure that some of you might disagree, or people who listen to this in the older generation, they might disagree, again, there's a balance. This isn't scientific, but the general consensus that we're seeing amongst Gen Z is that living with very set goals of what you should or could be doing might not bring you happiness in the long term. For some people, sure, it might. You could be really happy with house ownership, and that is going to be one of your longer term goals. I'm sure that for a lot of us, it is. But for other people, they realize that there's way more to life than simply accumulating wealth. Like it is with many things in our generation, we attribute this mindset shift to social media, as who would have guessed. The ability to see what other people are doing and in some ways experience what other people are doing, you actually get a sense for what you might want to try as well. You share ideas of places to go to. You think about locations that you can travel with friends. You hear about places that you've never been to or heard about before. And you see activities that maybe have never been on your mind, but maybe you saw a video of it and you think to yourself that, man, I want to do that before I die. And this, I think, is one of the really good things that actually has come out of social media. We see it in the research and Big Five tests, but Gen Z is very open minded, partially because we are part of the younger generation. And sure, as we age, it's probably likely to go down. But in general, we see that our openness to experiences is quite high. And this is actually beneficial for our happiness. In a paper of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, higher openness to experiences was correlated with greater happiness. Furthermore, the ability to maintain that openness as you age is also crucial for keeping you happy and being happy as you age. So it's not just about being open to everything and then picking one or two things that you figure that you really like and then these are the right things to do. It's actually continuing to have an open mindset regarding the world as you age. They suggest that this happens through mechanisms of acceptance and relationships. For one, you stay open to maintaining and forming new relationships as you age. And again, this is very crucial to your happiness. They note that people who are more open are also more imaginative, curious, and creative. They welcome the chance of good possibilities coming into their life rather than sticking with a norm, even if it's comfortable to them. And taking that extra risk and taking those dangers often pays off and makes them feel good. Obviously, though, if I'm talking about Gen Z, money, and social media, yep, it's going to come to the topic of materialism. I don't know about you, but personally, I feel like it's really easy to get caught up in the materialistic world. And you can see the next shiny thing that you want to buy or the next thing that you want to do. As someone who has been getting a bit more into fashion recently, I get it even more. There's a lot of novelty and joy in being able to buy a new piece to wear. And it only gets worse because trends are always changing. There's new things that you see that you want to buy that you think might look good. So you're thinking about getting it. And keeping up with those things can cost you a lot of money. And importantly, it's not just about how buying things makes you feel, but it's also that buying things can make you fit in. I'm reminded of this one TikTok, and I saw this mom who was telling her story about how her kid got made fun of at school because that kid didn't have a Stanley Cup. She had an off brand Walmart cup. And so there's just this group of girls who are making fun of her. So after her mom talks to her about it, and after the mom talks about how terrible it is, she also follows up and she says that, yeah, I'm going to buy the Stanley for my kid. Because if you're a parent, you too would probably spend a couple $100s to have your kid live a less stressful life. And this is just a prime example of how the use of social media can really corrupt your desire for materialistic things. You or other people around you have to find ways to fit in. And as soon as you become the person who isn't fitting in, as soon as you become that out group, when you don't feel like you belong and you don't feel like you have community, that's a really big hit to your mental health. Now, this isn't all to say that you shouldn't buy things that make you happy, or you shouldn't buy things that make you less stressed, or that you shouldn't buy things to try to fit in. That is ultimately what wealth is kind of designed for, and there's nothing wrong with it if you think in the long term it's going to actually make you happy. However, what's important is to recognize that having money, especially in terms of using it as a pursuit of happiness, is not going to be a long term solution. As I said before, money enhances happiness less so because of what we have and more so because of what it can enhance. It gives us great feelings of security, it gives us safety, peace of mind, and it can also improve our relationships. None of this has to do with material goods. So in 2014, Dittmar and others performed a massive meta analysis on research on materialistic orientation, and they found that across this entire analysis, the prioritization of money and materialistic goals are correlated to lower well being. They state that people with this orientation are at risk for the largest effects of risky consumer behaviors, like addictive purchasing habits or even negative self appraisal. They suggest that low levels of life satisfaction comes from needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness to others. But these might be inherently part of the materialistic attitude that when you are materialistic, you lack that autonomy, you lack that competence, and you lack that relatedness to others. You are more likely to exhibit traits like feeling less control over your life, that you appraise yourself and your competency negatively, and that you also value your relationships with others less. This is super interesting because the analysis implies and actually states that materialistic needs may consequently interfere with the ability of people to find ways to live happy and healthily. And remember, a materialistic orientation isn't just about thinking to yourself, I need the next new shiny thing. It's about materialistic pursuits in general. And I want to make that clear. It's not just about goods, it's about chasing happiness through the physical world, whether it be through a specific career path, chasing money, always wanting to buy the next thing, always wanting to experiencing the next thing, wanting fame. All of these things and chasing them can be a detriment to your well-being if you're actually placing it on the pedestal that that is going to be the thing that's going to fix your life. With our last bit of time, though, it's also probably worth it for me to talk about. How is it that we can be a little less materialistic? How can we focus on the things that will make us happy? And if you look at the rest of the time of the podcast, you can probably tell I don't actually have that much to say because there's surely a lot of things that you can do. But I'm going to offer one tip for you guys because I think it's the by far best thing that you can do. It's something that you can start today. And that is especially in relation to the topic of money and wealth. And this tip is going to be all about gratitude. People often say that we take things for granted, and I think that this is absolutely true for every aspect of our lives. But genuinely taking the time to be grateful for the things in your life shows real positive scientific effects. It's actually really crazy because I looked this up and I looked at the actual scientific studies, and they found that over a couple of months, the simple act of shifting your mind to express gratitude more often, even just to your brain, even just internally, can actually improve your sleep. It can improve your depression. It can improve your anxiety, chronic pain, and can even help disease. This is ridiculous because I want you to recognize that gratitude is something that happens purely internally to you. Think about it. You could win the lottery or you could win a massive giveaway, but you're more likely to feel the high and elation that comes with that win rather than gratefulness for what you've experienced. Equally, that means that once that high dies down, then you're kind of just looking for the next high. You're not actually really appreciating what happened to you. As soon as you're able to actually take in that gratefulness and be really thankful for the happy experiences that came to you, only then do you experience a lot of true happiness and long term joy because no longer do you need to look for the next high because that next high is already in you. The main reason for this is simply because gratitude triggers positive emotions, and positive emotions elicit better mental well being and thoughts, which ultimately becomes a massive feedback loop. Happy thoughts bring happiness, and happiness brings happy thoughts. It's spoken about a lot, but the experience of stress, for example, is really detrimental in the long term to our body. Yet we use stress really, really often, or we think about the stressful things in our life. In a way, I kind of believe that gratitude is basically the effective opposite of stress. Rather than focusing on the bad things, which sometimes you need, right? Sometimes you just need to finish a school project or whatever. But besides that, if you actually use gratitude well, it's going to give you the opportunity to take into your life the positives and not those negatives. Gratitude is one of those things that can be very easily trained. And something a lot of people like to do is keep a gratitude journal. So at the end of the day, they take three, maybe five things that happen to them, and they just express some simple gratitude to them. They make a conscious effort to understand that was a good experience, and I'm really thankful that I was able to deal with it today. I've actually had the experience where sometimes I tell people about this exercise and then people actually get hit with a block because they're like, how do I even start? How do I find three to five things to be grateful for? But I find that once you let yourself think and once you understand what you can be grateful for, it's really easy to get to flow. So, to give you some examples, I'll even read you a couple from my gratitude journal to give you some ideas. So, here I wrote that I'm really thankful that I have the means to get gas and to be able to drive to a station. I'm thankful for my friends responding to all of my silly Instagram reels. I'm thankful to myself because I drank 4 water bottles today and sometimes I'm pretty dehydrated. I'm thankful for one of my favorite artists this week. They dropped a new album, and even though I didn't like all the songs, I'm really happy that they still did it. I'm also really thankful for who I am. I'm someone who really derives genuine joy from doing this research for my podcast and talking to people about my research. It's something that not everyone does, and I'm not saying it makes me special or better than anyone, but I'm thankful for it because it makes me feel good. I think that a lot of these things are pretty small in the grand scheme of things. And it's also kind of funny because it reminds me of this like one meme that I saw. And it's like, someone's going through it when they start going on walks to appreciate the grass and the flowers, which honestly, it's really true. As someone who's been going through it, I can attest when you start appreciating the grass and the flowers and the fresh air in the world, that's when you know you're going through it. But I do also think it's applicable in the direction of deriving even more joy from life. One of the things that I hear, especially older adults, is that they're just really thankful to be alive and to be able to enjoy the moment. I think that for people in our age, so in Gen Z, we sometimes go through bad moments and we remind ourselves that there's good in the world to just help us recover. But we don't often take the next step forward. Usually, when we're feeling content with ourselves, we don't think to ourselves, how can I feel better? How can I be more grateful? And I think that if you try to find the step forward and you try to find the gratitude within ourselves, that's where more long term positive emotions are formed. Not necessarily even just happiness, but true contentedness with where you are. Back to the topic of this episode, though, ultimately, money is really important for our happiness, and gratitude, as much as it really helps, sometimes can't be the end solution. Yes, the research shows that expressing gratitude is generally beneficial to your mental health. And again, I really, really strongly promote you guys trying this exercise if you can. But the research also shows that if you want more money because you think it's going to make you more happy, that you're right. There's nothing wrong with wanting more money. And often, having money is a fantastic means to increase your happiness and enhance multiple aspects of your life. But remember, there's also a lot of people in the world who are happy even when they don't have a ton of money, even when they don't hit that threshold mark of $110,000 or whatever it's going to be in the future. All of the happiness really comes from within, it comes from acceptance. And once you are at more peace and at more joy with where you are, that's where you start becoming like those older adults who realize and say to themselves, life is hard. Life sucks, but I wish I didn't spend that much time in the office and I really took the time to smell the roses along the way. Very last thing for this episode before we close off, and I know that this episode could have come off as a bit depressing in some places, but I think it's worth noting that financially, the world together is really better than it ever was. We're living in times where the amount of people living in poverty is the lowest there's ever been. People today are figuring out ways to effectively use their money when given to charities and build financial support infrastructure. Yes, there is a lot of miserable news about things like the housing crisis, inflation, and the wealth gap. And I'm not denying that all of those things are true. But I am saying that you might be able to find yourself a little bit more happy if you find some gratitude in your heart for the wealth you have today that you might end up spending tomorrow. That concludes today's episode. And as always, word of mouth is the best way to support the podcast. If you thought about a friend or a coworker during this episode, share it with them. It really does help a lot. And if you enjoyed the episode, also leave a 5-star review wherever you get the podcast. I also really love when people shoot me a follow or just send me a message request on @mindofgenz podcast or @marco.my. I always love to chat about my research, future episode ideas, or just talk about anything in general. So if that's interesting to you, please feel free to reach out. And I thank you all again for listening. I will see you again next week for another chat. Until then, talk soon.